Some people are on social media every day, and yet leave almost no visual trace of themselves. They scroll in silence. They observe carefully. They absorb far more than they reveal. Their accounts exist. Their presence is real. But their image is absent. No selfies, no profile updates, no casual photos marking time. They might post a thought late at night, a quote that resonated quietly, a screenshot of words that already say what they didn't feel like explaining. They might share a photograph of a window, an empty street, a book left open on a table, but never themselves, not because they forgot, not because they don't know how, because the urge simply isn't there. They don't feel unfinished without being seen. They don't feel erased without proof. They don't feel pressure to anchor their identity visually. When others pause to take photos, they stay in the moment. When cameras turn outward, they turn inward. They don't reach for the lens instinctively. They don't measure moments by how they'll look later. They don't think in frames. They experience life without translating it. They may enjoy social platforms. They may understand their language fluently. They may even appreciate aesthetics. But they don't feel called to place themselves inside the image. Their face doesn't feel like content. Their expression doesn't feel like material. Their presence doesn't feel incomplete without display. They are comfortable being present without evidence. When tags appear, they remove them quietly. When others post group photos, they don't mind being cropped out. When visibility increases, they feel no pull toward it. They don't feel invisible. They feel intact. They don't experience absence as loss. They don't experience privacy as deprivation. They don't need the mirror of the crowd to confirm they're real. They may care deeply about authenticity. They may be thoughtful, reflective, observant. They simply don't experience exposure as connection. Their sense of self isn't reinforced by being looked at. They don't document who they are. They inhabit it. They don't announce their presence. They allow it. They don't trade interior life for recognition. They don't exchange control for visibility. And this choice, quiet, consistent, unannounced, stands out more than it seems. Because in a world where faces confirm existence, choosing not to show one becomes noticeable. And that is where interpretation begins. When someone doesn't post their photo on social media, the absence rarely stays neutral. It invites interpretation almost immediately. Because in digital spaces, visibility has become shorthand for presence. Faces function as proof. Images serve as confirmation. So when that proof is missing, people begin filling in gaps. The most common assumption is insecurity. That the person must dislike how they look. That they're uncomfortable with their appearance. That they're avoiding judgment because they fear it. The logic feels simple to observers. If you felt confident, you would show yourself. So restraint is reframed as lack. If not insecurity, then secrecy. People wonder what's being hidden, what's being protected, what isn't being shared. Privacy becomes suspicious instead of neutral. There's an unspoken belief that openness equals honesty, that visibility equals authenticity, that withholding equals distance. So when someone doesn't share their image, it's quietly categorized as avoidance. They're thought to be guarded, hard to read, emotionally closed, even when nothing else about them suggests this. Their silence around appearance is interpreted louder than their words. If they post thoughts, people notice the absence of a face. If they share opinions, people wonder why they won't share themselves. If they participate consistently, people still ask why they won't fully participate, as if participation has a visual requirement. as if identity must be confirmed visually to be valid. This misunderstanding is reinforced by platform design. Algorithms reward faces, feeds privilege familiarity, profiles expect representation. So choosing not to post a photo quietly violates an unspoken rule. And when rules are violated without explanation, people assume a reason. Often that reason is fear. They're labelled as shy, socially anxious, uncomfortable with attention. Their preference is medicalized or minimized. What could simply be a boundary becomes a limitation. And because these assumptions are rarely stated directly, they operate beneath the surface, in subtle comments, in curious questions, in repeated suggestions. Just post one. It's not a big deal. No one cares. As if the person is overthinking something simple. But the pressure doesn't come from concern. It comes from normalization. From the idea that posting your face is basic participation. That opting out is strange. That it needs explanation. Sometimes the misunderstanding takes another form. Not insecurity, but arrogance. People assume the person thinks they're above it. Too private. Too aloof. That they're withholding themselves intentionally to create distance. That they're controlling the narrative. That they don't want to be accessible. So restraint is reframed as superiority. Either way, insecurity or arrogance. The conclusion is the same. Something is wrong. Something is off. Something needs to be interpreted. Very rarely is the possibility considered. That the person simply doesn't experience posting their photo as necessary. That the absence is not a statement, not a strategy, not a reaction, just a preference. Because the culture around social media has collapsed choice into meaning. Every action signals something. Every absence communicates something. Every silence demands interpretation. So not posting a photo is rarely allowed to remain what it is. It's translated into a story that fits the observer's framework. And over time, this story becomes expectation. People stop inviting visibility, stop asking, stop leaving space. They decide who the person is without asking. Not out of malice, not out of judgment, but out of habit, because when visibility is the norm, those who opt out are always assumed to be opting away from something. And that assumption quietly misses the point. Not posting one's photo is rarely about hiding. More often, it is about where identity is experienced. For some people, identity is not something that lives comfortably on the surface. It doesn't feel fixed. It doesn't feel visual. It doesn't feel complete when flattened into an image. A photograph asks for something very specific. It asks for stillness. It asks for definition. It asks for a single version of the self to stand in for the whole. And for certain people, that feels inaccurate. They experience themselves as changing from moment to moment, as contextual, as responsive. Who they are depends on where they are, who they're with, what's being exchanged. A photo interrupts that fluidity. It freezes something that doesn't feel meant to be frozen. So choosing not to post isn't about fear of being seen. It's about reluctance to be reduced. Once an image exists, it begins to function independently. It can be saved, shared, reinterpreted. It becomes an object others can hold without the person present. And for individuals who are sensitive to context, this separation matters. They are aware, sometimes acutely, that images invite projection. A smile is interpreted, an expression is decoded. A still frame becomes evidence. People decide what it means without checking. So withholding an image is a way of preserving dimensionality, not because the person is fragile, but because they are precise about how they want to be encountered. They prefer to be known through interaction rather than inspection, through tone rather than appearance, through rhythm rather than resemblance. Language allows adjustment, conversation allows clarification, presence allows correction. Images do not. Images declare. And for some, that declaration feels final in a way that doesn't match how they experience themselves. This is especially true for people whose inner life is rich and active. They think deeply. They reflect often. They notice nuance. Their sense of self is internally generated rather than externally reinforced. So the feedback loop of visibility, post, receive, reaction, adjust, feels unnecessary or even distorting. They don't need reflection to feel real. They don't need recognition to feel present. Their identity stabilizes from the inside. This doesn't mean they reject connection. In fact, many of them connect intensely. They listen carefully. They respond thoughtfully. They show up consistently. But they do so through engagement rather than exposure. Their presence is relational, not representational. They exist in exchange, not display. There is also often an awareness of how visibility alters interaction. Once a face is known, expectations form. People assume familiarity. They assume access. They assume continuity. Remaining unseen preserves a certain openness. It allows interactions to form around content rather than appearance, around resonance rather than recognition. This can feel cleaner, less distorted, less performative, because being seen visually often invites comparison. Comparison introduces hierarchy. Hierarchy introduces pressure. And some people simply do not want to participate in that economy, not because they are above it, but because it doesn't align with how they experience selfhood. They sense that constant visibility demands a stable persona, a recognizable look, a consistent presentation, a maintained version of the self, and they don't live that way internally. So they opt out, not dramatically, not defiantly, but quietly. They keep their image unshared, not as resistance, not as avoidance, but as alignment. Alignment with an inner experience that values presence over proof, continuity over capture, and authorship over exposure. They are not absent, they are simply unconverted. You don't need to arrive at a reason that satisfies anyone else. You don't need to translate your inner clarity into something more visible. You don't need to make your boundaries understandable to be allowed to have them. There is nothing incomplete about remaining unseen. Your presence does not require evidence. Your reality does not need confirmation. Your identity does not need to be anchored to an image. It is allowed that you exist without display. It is allowed that connection happens without visual access. It is allowed that some parts of you remain unshared and intact. You are not withholding yourself. You are not being difficult. You are not failing to participate. You are choosing how you are encountered. You don't owe platforms a version of your face. You don't owe others a visual summary of who you are. You don't owe consistency in appearance to remain recognizable. It is allowed that your selfhood stays fluid, that it changes without announcement, that it resists being pinned down. You are not required to become content. You are not required to turn your presence into material. You are not required to be searchable, taggable, or archived. You can exist without being captured. quietly, intentionally, without explanation, and nothing needs to be shown to prove that you are here.